When you picture Christmas, what do you see? I bet it's twinkling lights, a big festive tree, maybe a cozy family get-together. But what if I told you that the holiday we all know and love was actually outlawed at one point? Seriously. And get this, the very first war on Christmas wasn't started by secularists, it was waged by deeply devout Christians. Let's unwrap this thing. Right? The tree, the gifts, the carols, that huge family dinner, all of it feels so timeless, doesn't it? Like it's just always been this way. But the truth is, a lot of our most cherished traditions are actually pretty new. And for a long, long time, celebrating Christmas like this wasn't just frowned upon. It was literally a crime. And here's the proof right here. This is an actual public notice from the 17th century Massachusetts Bay Colony. It flat out says that celebrating Christmas with feasting or giving gifts, or even just taking the day off work, was a satanical practice. The penalty? A fine of 5 shillings. So what on earth was going on? Well, this period is what you could call the first war on Christmas. And the most important thing to understand is that it came from inside the house. The fight was started by the Puritans, a super religious Protestant group in England and its American colonies who had some major theological problems with the holiday. Their whole opposition was built on one core idea from the Protestant Reformation, sola scriptura, which basically means scripture alone. The thinking was pretty simple. If a religious practice isn't specifically laid out in the Bible, then it's a man-made invention, and it's gotta go. This quote from the Westminster Confession of Faith really gets to the heart of it. For a Puritan, worshiping God according to the imaginations and devices of men, well, that wasn't just a small mistake. It was a huge dishonor to God. So they looked at Christmas, searched the Bible, and found nothing. So let's break down their list of complaints. First, like we said, it's not in the Bible, not a word. Second, they saw really clear connections to old pagan festivals, like the Roman party known as Saturnalia. Third, they thought it was way too tied up in the Catholic pomp, all the fancy, elaborate services. And finally, they just hated how people actually celebrated. You know, the drinking, the feasting, and these wild traditions like wassailing. To them, the whole thing was just an excuse for carnal and sensual delights. Now, this wasn't just some friendly debate. It had a huge political fallout. As the Puritans gained power back in England during the Civil War, they turned their beliefs into law. You can see how it all went down right here. In 1647, Parliament officially bans Christmas. A little more than 10 years later, the Massachusetts Bay Colony does the same thing. And even after the monarchy comes back in England in 1660 and lifts the ban there, it took Massachusetts another 21 years to finally get rid of its anti-Christmas law. But here's the thing. You can't just pass a law and expect a centuries-old party to just stop. While Christmas was officially off the books, the traditions themselves didn't just disappear. They just went underground. I mean, think about it. The ban was super hard to enforce. There was no modern police force, and a whole lot of people really did not like this law. So what did they do? Many just kept celebrating, but in secret. The carols, the festive meals, it all just moved behind closed doors, far away from any prying eyes. And this is where it gets really interesting. The holiday became a political symbol. The royalists, the folks who supported the king who'd been kicked out, started passing around these little pamphlets featuring a character named Father Christmas. Now, he wasn't a gift giver like Santa. He was a symbol of the good old days of feasting and fun. His return was tied to the return of the king, which meant celebrating Christmas was now an act of political defiance. Now, you'd think that after the ban was finally lifted, Christmas would just snap right back. But it didn't. In fact, it kind of went into a long slump. It would take a whole other cultural revolution, almost 200 years later in the Victorian era, to basically create the holiday that we all recognize today. So for most of the 18th century, Christmas was just a shadow of its former self, especially in America, where that Puritan influence was still really strong. But then in the 19th century, the Victorian era, boom. Everything changes. The holiday gets completely reinvented. It becomes sentimental, family-focused, and, yeah, commercialized. Pretty much the Christmas we have now. This massive transformation was really pushed along by a few key players. You had Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband, who brought the German tradition of the Christmas tree over to England and made it cool. You had writers like Washington Irving and, of course, Charles Dickens with A Christmas Carol, who totally redefined the holidays vibe to be about family, charity, and nostalgia. At the exact same time, a religious revival called the Oxford Movement was pushing for more ceremony and ritual in the church. Put it all together, and you get the blueprint for modern Christmas. And this revival wasn't just talk. At Oxford, this guy John Bloxham started bringing back these super elaborate Christmas traditions. I mean, look at this description of his Christmas Eve party. It was this lavish feast with all the traditional food, and they were even using the college's most valuable silver. It is a world away from the Puritans and their 5-shilling fine for feasting, right? The holiday's big comeback was finally sealed in 1870. That's the year the U.S. Congress, more than 200 years after the Puritans first tried to stamp it out, officially declared Christmas a federal holiday. But of course, the story doesn't just end there. The ghost of that 17th century fight, it still kind of haunts our conversations about the holiday today. That core theological argument that the Puritans made, it never completely disappeared. To this day, there are some Reformed and Presbyterian communities that still debate this regulative principle of worship and whether it's right for Christians to celebrate holidays that aren't actually in the Bible. And what about that phrase, war on Christmas? Well, it got brought back in the 20th century, but for a totally different battle. People from Henry Ford all the way to commentators like Bill O'Reilly repurposed it. But now, the argument was that secular forces were trying to take Christ out of Christmas, which is a complete flip from the original conflict, where it was devout Christians trying to take the unbiblical holiday out of Christianity. So the Christmas we celebrate is this really complex mix, right? It's woven together from pagan symbols, religious rebellion, political defiance, and a whole lot of Victorian sentimentality. When you're decorating your tree or singing a carol this year, you're actually taking part in a story that's way deeper and way more controversial than you probably ever thought. The only question is, what part of that history will you see?